All right, example 5 is really more of, it's not so much an example, it's just kind of talking you through some of the ways that we can translate English into Boolean statements, into propositional logic. The key thing to understand is there's more than one way to do it. So there's, I'm not going to say, yeah, there's no right answer. Now there are plenty of wrong answers, but there's no right answer. So just keep that in mind. So the first kind of English statement that we want to look at is the if-then, right? Which is what we've been seeing, and it's P, implies Q. And that's pretty straightforward. This is sometimes written Q if P. So watch out for that other way of phrasing. In fact, that's really more of the English way of phrasing it. We don't usually say, if this happens, then that will happen. We say, I'm going to go to the car wash if I have money, right? We don't say, if I have money, then I will go to the car wash. So Q if P is another form of really the same statement. So be aware of that. That one's pretty straightforward. Okay, the next format that we need to look at is the only if. Only if I finish studying will I go to the party, right? Which is really a not Q implies not P scenario, right? If I don't finish studying, excuse me, if I don't go to the party, I didn't finish studying. And remember, not Q implies not P is the exact same as P implies Q. It's the contrapositive, but they have the same truth table. They're logically equivalent. So only if is another common way of saying it that really is not Q implies P, even though we don't say it that way. That's how we say it. You know what I'm saying? Okay. And like I said, for many of these statements, there are multiple ways to interpret them, and that's okay. There's more than one right way to interpret them. Okay, then we have the common if and only if, right? If and only if is really Q is really a bidirectional implication, right? If and only if is P implies Q and Q implies P, right? So I'm getting up out of bed in the morning if and only if my alarm clock goes off, right? My alarm clock causes me to get up out of bed, and if I got up out of bed, that means my alarm clock went off. So each implies that the other one is true, right? That's if and only if. Sufficient is another one that translates directly into, P implies Q. So if I say, if we have bread that is sufficient for sandwiches, right? It doesn't quite translate that well into English. You could think of it as P is sufficient to force Q to happen. P by itself will force Q to happen, which is closer. Sufficient is really linked, is used a lot in math and proofs, and is linked to the next thing we're going to talk about, necessary. Okay. When we say P is necessary for Q, we're really saying without P, Q won't happen, which translates logically to not P implies not Q, which we know is the contrapositive to Q implies P, which leads us to the next statement, necessary and sufficient. So we know that sufficient is P implies Q, and we know that necessary is Q implies P. So if it's necessary and sufficient, that means, it must mean, that Q and P have a double implication, right? That's what necessary and sufficient means. Honestly, this does not come up a huge amount when human beings speak English. When have you ever said that something was necessary and sufficient? This is math terminology, and when we're doing proofs in math, we use terms like necessary and sufficient. If we say it's sufficient, we mean by itself it could possibly cause it to happen. When we say it's necessary and sufficient, we're saying both of them have to happen. They cause each other. And like I said, we don't need to worry about that too much, but you need to be aware of it in that in higher level courses, those terms come up. In particular, those of you going on to Cal State Long Beach, they have a second course in discrete structures. So that one might come out and get you. All right? Probably the most confusing of all of these different ways of making Boolean statements in English is unless. So we say, you know, P unless Q. You might say something like, I'm going to work unless I'm drunk, right? In that case, not Q, not being drunk, implies P, that I'm going to work. It's not as confusing as it seems, but it's the way we say things in English, we don't usually have that clean of an unless statement. So you might need to fiddle around with the words a little bit before that can happen. The other thing is, remember, the contrapositive is the same statement. So what's the contrapositive? We flip the direction. So we have a P going to Q, and then we flip the signs. So we have not P implies, because this was a not, this becomes Q. So not P implies Q. If I didn't go to work, it's because I was drunk, right? So the contrapositive is the same statement, and often with unless, that's more useful. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about translating English into Boolean terms. Try to do a few on your own to practice. Obviously, we have the homework assignment, but you should practice a few on your own just to get the feel for it. If you have any questions, put them in the forum below. And in fact, let me do this. Extra credit, if you put a statement in the forum and then somebody else translates it into its Boolean equivalent, its propositional logic equivalent, and you translate somebody else's, I'll give you extra credit. So in the forum below, put your own English statement and somebody else come along and translate that into a propositional statement. All right? If you have any other questions, ask them in the forum too.